Meghan Markle's fate is sealed. Her final sentence just changed everything forever. In a stunning turn of events, Meghan Markle's courtroom battle has reached its dramatic conclusion, sending shockwaves across the globe. Accusations of bribery, manipulation, and orchestrated deception have led to a final verdict that could alter her life permanently. But how did it all come crashing down? What secrets were uncovered during the trial that sealed her fate? And what does this mean for the royal family moving forward? Stay with us as we reveal the shocking details behind Meghan Markle's final goodbye and the explosive evidence that brought it all to light. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. In the grand halls of Buckingham Palace, where tradition reigns supreme and decorum is paramount, a scandal unlike any other has shaken the monarchy to its core. For centuries, the British royal family has faced challenges, from political intrigue to public scrutiny, but nothing quite prepared them for this. Allegations of racism, betrayal, and deceit, all traced back to one of their own, Meghan Markle. The world watched in shock as Meghan Markle, the Duchess of Sussex, spoke openly about her struggles within the royal family. In her now infamous interview with Oprah Winfrey, she painted a picture of isolation, discrimination, and cruelty. The most shocking revelation came when she insinuated that there had been conversations within the palace about the potential skin color of her then-unborn son, Archie. The world gasped. Accusations of racism within the British monarchy? It was unprecedented and damning. But as the dust settled, whispers began to circulate. Was Meghan telling the whole truth? Could the Duchess, often portrayed as a victim of royal rigidity, have orchestrated something far more sinister? Recent explosive evidence has surfaced, suggesting that Meghan may have paid staff to fabricate these damaging allegations, an elaborate plot to tarnish the royal reputation and secure her status as a global victim. What would drive someone to go to such lengths? Was this a calculated move to manipulate public perception, or a desperate attempt to maintain relevance after stepping away from royal duties? To understand the gravity of this story, we must trace Meghan's journey from Hollywood actress to royal outcast and delve into the turbulent path that led her to this moment of infamy. From the moment Meghan Markle entered the spotlight as Prince Harry's love interest, the media could not get enough. Here was an American actress, biracial and independent, stepping into one of the most conservative institutions in the world. The narrative was ripe with tension, offering endless fodder for headlines. Initially, the public seemed to embrace Meghan, captivated by her charm and wit. She was seen as a breath of fresh air, modern, outspoken, and undeniably different from the royals of the past. Yet, as the fascination grew, so did the scrutiny. Meghan's every move was dissected, her wardrobe choices analyzed, and her statements parsed for deeper meaning. The tabloids branded her a disruptor, while her supporters celebrated her willingness to break the mold. However, as quickly as admiration blossomed, criticism followed. Stories of staff resignations, family estrangements, and a fractured relationship with her own father painted Meghan as both a victim and a villain. The royal family, known for their stoicism, remained silent as public opinion wavered. Then came the fateful Oprah interview. Sitting side by side with Prince Harry, Meghan's demeanor was somber, her words carefully chosen but seething with pain. She spoke of feeling abandoned and marginalized within the royal institution. But the real bombshell was the allegation of racism. One sentence, one carefully worded insinuation ignited a global firestorm. Suddenly, the royal family found themselves at the center of a racial controversy. Calls for accountability erupted across social media, and prominent figures weighed in, demanding explanations from the monarchy. The palace, caught off guard, issued a terse statement, expressing sadness over Meghan's struggles and vowing to address the issues privately. Yet, behind the palace gates, the atmosphere was anything but calm. A rift had formed, not just between Meghan and the monarchy but within the family itself. Prince William was reportedly furious, feeling his brother had betrayed their shared commitment to royal duty. Queen Elizabeth, renowned for her unwavering resolve, faced perhaps the most challenging crisis of her reign. As the world debated the veracity of Meghan's claims, one detail kept resurfacing: the elusive source of the racism allegation. Meghan never named the person who allegedly made the comment, leading to rampant speculation. Prince Charles, Prince William, even the Queen herself were dragged into the conversation, their reputations hanging by a thread. But just as the controversy seemed to fade, a new wave of revelations crashed ashore. Investigative journalists began digging deeper, following a trail that led to an unexpected twist. A former palace staff member, seeking to clear their name after being implicated in the fallout, approached a major news outlet with a claim that would flip the narrative on its head. The staffer alleged that Meghan had offered financial incentives to several aides to corroborate her story of racism and mistreatment. Emails, text messages, and confidential recordings reportedly backed up this claim. The staffer insisted they had been pressured to lie to protect Meghan's narrative and secure her public sympathy. If proven true, these allegations would not only damage Meghan's reputation beyond repair, but also vindicate the royal family, who had maintained their innocence throughout. Legal experts weighed in, suggesting that paying individuals to fabricate accusations could lead to severe legal consequences, including charges of perjury and defamation. Yet, as the story gained traction, Meghan's legal team categorically denied the allegations, dismissing them as a desperate attempt to smear her character. They threatened lawsuits against anyone spreading what they called false and defamatory rumors. But the evidence, mountains of it, continued to pile up. In the court of public opinion, reactions were mixed. Some defended Meghan, convinced that this was another attempt by the establishment to silence a woman who dared to speak out. Others, however, felt betrayed, questioning whether they had been manipulated into believing a narrative crafted to destroy the monarchy. As pressure mounted, Meghan remained publicly composed, but insiders reported that her inner circle was in chaos. Damage control strategies were hastily drafted, and trusted allies were summoned to help rebuild her crumbling image. Despite the pushback, the tide seemed to be turning. The British public, traditionally loyal to the monarchy, expressed growing discontent. Many felt that Meghan's actions had inflicted irreparable harm on an institution that, despite its flaws, remained an integral part of national identity. Protesters gathered outside royal residences, demanding that Meghan's titles be stripped and her influence curtailed. As the truth continues to unfold, one question lingers. How will history remember Meghan Markle? Will she be seen as a victim who fought against institutional racism, or as a cunning manipulator who wove a web of lies for personal gain? The unraveling of Meghan Markle's alleged deception didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual process, one that began with whispers in the palace corridors and ended with explosive revelations that would forever alter the public's perception of the Duchess of Sussex. The journey from beloved American actress to a controversial royal figure is riddled with questions of manipulation, strategy, and ambition. To truly understand the gravity of the situation, it is essential to trace the timeline and dissect the events that led to her dramatic fall from grace. The narrative began with Meghan's meteoric rise. She stepped into the spotlight as Prince Harry's love interest, and almost overnight, the world was captivated. She was described as the modern-day fairy tale, a biracial American actress capturing the heart of a British prince. The media frenzy was palpable, with headlines praising her beauty, charm, and outspokenness. She was hailed as a breath of fresh air, someone who could potentially modernize the royal family. There was talk of change, of progress, and of a new era for the monarchy. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the royal family had been injected with a sense of relatability and modernity that it so desperately needed. But not everyone within the palace walls shared that sentiment. Behind the scenes, Meghan's arrival was met with tension. Palace aides whispered of her demands, her insistence on breaking royal protocol, and her determination to do things her way. Reports surfaced of staff resignations, of shouting matches, and of a growing divide between Meghan and the traditionalists within the monarchy. The once rosy image began to crack, exposing glimpses of discord and discontent. Yet, the real turning point came with the Oprah Winfrey interview. In that fateful sit-down, Meghan and Harry made allegations that sent shockwaves across the globe. Meghan spoke of feeling isolated and unsupported, of mental health struggles that went ignored, and most controversially, of a senior royal allegedly expressing concerns over Archie's potential skin color. The allegations were incendiary, implying deep-seated racism within one of the world's most respected institutions. The fallout was immediate. The British press erupted, political figures weighed in, and the public found itself divided. For many, Meghan became a symbol of resilience, a woman who bravely spoke out against injustice. For others, she was seen as manipulative, someone who weaponized her narrative for personal gain. The royal family, bound by their age-old policy of maintaining a dignified silence, issued a brief statement expressing sadness over the claims and promising to handle the matter privately. But it was too late. The damage was done. What followed was a series of strategic moves that, in hindsight, began to paint a different picture. Meghan and Harry secured lucrative deals with Netflix and Spotify, both platforms that would allow them to tell their story on their terms. They moved to California, distancing themselves physically and symbolically from the monarchy. Public appearances were meticulously curated to showcase their humanitarian efforts, while subtle jabs at the royal family continued to emerge in interviews and podcasts. Then came the leaks, small at first, almost unnoticeable. Former palace aides began speaking to journalists, dropping hints that not all was as it seemed. One former staff member claimed that Meghan had a pattern of demanding loyalty from those around her, often expecting them to publicly defend her even when the truth was murkier. Another aide mentioned that Meghan had a tendency to exaggerate stories, embellishing details to paint herself as the perpetual victim. At first, these claims were dismissed as sour grapes from disgruntled employees, but the murmurs continued to grow. The breakthrough came when one particularly bold whistleblower stepped forward, armed with evidence that would shift the narrative entirely. This whistleblower, a former palace employee with direct access to the Sussex household, presented a cache of emails, text messages, and voice recordings that suggested Meghan had incentivized certain staff members to corroborate her allegations of racism and mistreatment. According to these claims, financial incentives were promised in exchange for their testimonies. The whistleblower detailed how staff members were allegedly coached on what to say during private interviews and even during the Oprah sit-down. The evidence was damning. Messages allegedly sent from Meghan herself outlined specific narratives she wanted emphasized. One particular email reportedly read, "We need to make it clear that I was ostracized because of my background. They must understand what I went through." Another message to a senior aide outlined the need to keep the focus on race. Don't let them distract from that. These revelations painted a chilling picture of calculated manipulation, far removed from the image of a helpless victim. As the evidence mounted, legal experts began to weigh in on the potential repercussions. If these claims were proven true, Meghan could face severe legal consequences, including defamation lawsuits and even perjury if it was found that she lied under oath. Furthermore, her standing in Hollywood began to waver. Prominent figures distanced themselves, wary of becoming entangled in the unfolding scandal. Sponsors reportedly began to reconsider their partnerships, worried about the potential backlash. But Meghan's camp was not silent. Her legal team swiftly moved to discredit the whistleblower, labeling them as a disgruntled former employee seeking revenge. They issued statements denying all allegations, maintaining that Meghan's accounts of racism and mistreatment were entirely truthful. They threatened lawsuits against any media outlets that spread what they called malicious lies. Yet, despite their attempts at damage control, the floodgates had opened. More former staff members began coming forward, some anonymously, others openly, each with their own stories of alleged manipulation and coercion. The royal family, still reeling from the initial accusations, remained silent. However, insiders reported that crisis talks were held, with senior royals expressing frustration over the situation. Prince William, in particular, was said to be livid, feeling that the allegations had unfairly tarnished the family's reputation. Queen Elizabeth, renowned for her unflappable demeanor, was reportedly deeply saddened by the entire ordeal. The monarchy, which had weathered countless storms over its centuries-long reign, now found itself under a spotlight that grew increasingly unforgiving with each passing day. Public opinion began to shift. Initially swayed by Meghan's allegations, many began to question the validity of her claims in light of the mounting evidence. Social media erupted with debates, and news outlets ran exposés dissecting every new piece of information. Hashtags like #JusticeForTheCrown and #TruthAboutMeghan began to trend, signaling a growing skepticism towards her narrative. Polls indicated that public support for Meghan had begun to wane, with many expressing feelings of betrayal. As the momentum of the scandal continued to build, Meghan found herself increasingly isolated. Friends in Hollywood, once eager to champion her cause, grew distant. Endorsements and sponsorships dwindled. Public appearances became less frequent, and when they did occur, the reception was noticeably colder. The image of the strong, independent duchess who broke barriers was now overshadowed by accusations of deceit and manipulation. The royal family, on the other hand, began to make strategic moves to restore their image. Public engagements increased, with Prince William and Kate Middleton taking on more high-profile appearances. Their messaging became more transparent, focusing on unity and resilience. For the first time in years, the monarchy seemed to have reclaimed some of its lost respect, standing firm in the face of controversy. As the scandal deepened, the royal family began to shift its strategy. The initial silence had been interpreted by many as an admission of guilt or, at the very least, complicity. But behind the palace walls, senior aides and advisors were devising a meticulous plan to reclaim the narrative and restore the monarchy's standing. The Queen, whose decades of reign had seen countless scandals and political crises, knew that this was a different kind of storm, one that required a delicate but firm response. In a surprising move, Buckingham Palace announced that it would cooperate with a full investigation into the racism allegations. This was not a mere internal review. It was a transparent, independent probe that promised to look into the claims Meghan had made during the Oprah interview. For the first time, the royal family openly acknowledged the seriousness of the allegations and committed to uncovering the truth, whatever that truth might be. The announcement was met with mixed reactions. Meghan's supporters saw it as a victory, proof that her bravery had forced the monarchy to confront its own prejudices. Critics, however, viewed it as a calculated move to shift blame away from the institution and onto Meghan herself. Meanwhile, the whistleblower who had initially stepped forward with allegations of bribery and fabricated stories was no longer alone. Encouraged by the media exposure and the palace's pledge to investigate, more former staff members began to emerge from the shadows. Some spoke anonymously, fearing backlash, while others went public with their testimonies. Their stories painted a disturbing picture, one of manipulation, coercion, and financial incentives designed to bolster Meghan's narrative. One former aide, who had worked closely with Meghan during her time at Kensington Palace, described a hostile work environment, not from the royal family, but from Meghan herself. According to this insider, Meghan was determined to control the narrative, even if it meant bending the truth. She was always very clear about how things should look in the media, the aide revealed. If there was a negative story, she would demand that we counter it with something sympathetic, whether it was true or not. The aide went on to describe instances where staff members were pressured to speak to reporters off the record, planting stories that aligned with Meghan's claims of victimhood and discrimination. Another former employee shared emails that detailed Meghan's alleged plan to leverage accusations of racism as a means to secure her place within the royal family. In one email, Meghan reportedly outlined how certain narratives needed to be emphasized in public statements. "It's important that the focus remains on racial prejudice," one line read. "This is where public sympathy will be strongest." These revelations, if proven true, indicated a strategic manipulation of public sentiment, an effort to weaponize sensitive issues for personal gain. The palace investigation, headed by independent advisors with no direct ties to the monarchy, began its inquiries. Staff members, former aides, and even journalists were summoned to provide statements. The process was slow and methodical, with the palace releasing periodic updates to the public. In a bid to maintain transparency, weekly press briefings were held, and the findings were published in incremental stages. The strategy appeared to work. Public opinion began to tilt back in favor of the monarchy, with many expressing newfound respect for the Queen's commitment to transparency. But Meghan was not backing down. From her home in California, she released statements through her publicist, maintaining her innocence and doubling down on her claims. In one particularly bold move, she gave an interview to a prominent American news outlet, where she accused the royal family of orchestrating a smear campaign to silence her. She spoke tearfully of the pressure she faced and the emotional toll of being branded a liar. The interview was powerful and evocative, sparking a new wave of sympathy for Meghan and reigniting the firestorm of debate across social media platforms. Yet, as the investigation pressed on, the evidence against Meghan continued to mount. One particularly damning revelation came in the form of financial records. A leaked document showed substantial payments made to palace aides who had been vocal about their support for Meghan's claims of mistreatment. The payments, labeled as consultation fees, raised eyebrows among investigators. When questioned, the aides insisted the money was for legitimate services, but the timing of the transactions aligned almost perfectly with Meghan's public statements. Investigators began to probe deeper, analyzing email trails and message logs that suggested a coordinated effort to craft and amplify narratives of racial prejudice within the palace. At this stage, the media's portrayal of Meghan began to shift. Once seen as the underdog fighting against a powerful institution, she now faced growing skepticism. Headlines that once championed her bravery began to question her motives. Prominent news anchors who had openly supported her claims now expressed doubt. Social media was flooded with hashtags like #JusticeForTheCrown and #MeghanExposed, signaling a growing movement against the Duchess of Sussex. Even American outlets, which had largely been sympathetic to her plight, started airing segments dissecting the evidence that had surfaced. Meghan's response was swift and decisive. Through her legal team, she launched defamation lawsuits against key media organizations and individual whistleblowers, accusing them of spreading falsehoods and malicious lies. In a statement released to the press, her lawyers condemned the investigation as biased and politically motivated. They vowed to fight back, declaring that Meghan would not be silenced by what they described as a coordinated character assassination. The lawsuits were strategic, designed to stifle dissent and halt the spread of damaging information. But the strategy backfired. Instead of silencing her critics, it emboldened them. Former aides who had remained silent out of fear of legal repercussions began coming forward, their testimonies growing increasingly bold and detailed. The royal family remained steadfast in their silence, allowing the investigation to unfold without interference. Prince William and Kate Middleton made more frequent public appearances, projecting an image of stability and unity. The Queen, ever the symbol of resilience, continued with her royal duties, embodying the concept of dignified silence that had long been a hallmark of her reign. It was clear that the palace was committed to outlasting the storm, banking on the investigation to clear its name and restore its reputation. As the investigation neared its conclusion, the tension reached a boiling point. The palace announced that the findings would be released in a televised special, a move unprecedented in royal history. The broadcast was scheduled for prime time, promising transparency and accountability to the British public. Speculation ran wild in the days leading up to the event. Would Meghan be vindicated? Would the monarchy be exposed for its alleged racial prejudices? Or would the truth reveal something far more sinister, an orchestrated plot of manipulation designed to dismantle the very institution that she once vowed to serve? The anticipation was palpable. News outlets ran countdowns to the special, political commentators weighed in, and the public braced themselves for what was promised to be a defining moment in royal history. In the days leading up to the release, Meghan was notably silent. Her social media accounts went dormant, and her publicist refused to answer calls for comment. Some interpreted this as a sign of preparation, while others viewed it as an admission of guilt. The truth, however, would soon be revealed to the world, and the consequences would be felt for generations to come. The day of the televised special arrived with an atmosphere of anticipation and tension that could be felt across the United Kingdom and beyond. People gathered around their screens, some in silence, others in heated discussion, as the familiar crest of the royal family appeared on the broadcast. The camera panned slowly over Buckingham Palace, its stoic architecture standing tall against the storm that had threatened its legacy. The presenter, a well-respected journalist known for his impartiality, appeared on screen with a solemn expression. He began by recounting the timeline of events: Meghan's initial allegations, the Oprah interview, the global reaction, and the subsequent investigation led by independent advisors. His tone was measured, neither accusatory nor sympathetic, as he laid out the facts that had dominated headlines for months. The purpose of this special, he began, is to provide clarity, transparency, and accountability. For centuries, the royal family has been a symbol of tradition and stability. However, it is not immune to controversy. Today, we present to you the findings of an investigation that has captured global attention and cast shadows of doubt upon one of the world's oldest institutions. The camera cut to the lead investigator, a stern-faced woman with decades of experience in forensic auditing and public inquiry. Her presence alone lent credibility to the process. She was known for her ruthlessness in uncovering corruption and dishonesty. She began to speak, her voice clear and unwavering, as she outlined the scope of the investigation: over 200 hours of interviews, thousands of documents analyzed, and countless emails and messages scrutinized. She laid out the findings methodically, point by point. First, she addressed the allegations of racism that Meghan had made during the Oprah interview. The investigation had combed through internal palace communications, interviewed senior members of the royal household, and cross-referenced statements given by aides and staff members. Surprisingly, no credible evidence was found to support the claim that senior royals had discussed concerns over Archie's skin color. The report did not suggest that the allegations were fabricated, but it did raise questions about their validity. The investigator paused, letting that revelation sink in before continuing. Next came the financial records. This was where the tone of the broadcast shifted from investigative to explosive. The lead investigator produced a set of documents, each marked with the royal family's insignia. These were internal financial logs that detailed payments made to specific aides who had publicly supported Meghan's claims. The logs showed substantial sums labeled as consultation fees and media preparation. When cross-referenced with the dates of key interviews and press releases, the transactions aligned almost perfectly. The lead investigator explained that these payments were marked as standard disbursements, but upon closer inspection, there were irregularities. The sums were unusually high for consultation work, and several of the recipients had no official role in the public relations strategy for the royal family. When questioned during the investigation, 2 former aides admitted under oath that they had been approached with offers of financial compensation in exchange for corroborating Meghan's narrative of mistreatment and racism. Their testimonies were damning. Both claimed they had been pressured to echo Meghan's sentiments during media interviews, even when their personal experiences did not match her allegations. The camera cut back to the journalist, who looked visibly shaken by the revelations. He paused for a moment, clearly absorbing the gravity of what had just been shared, before proceeding. These findings, he stated, his voice firm, cast a shadow of doubt not only on the allegations themselves, but on the integrity of those who supported them. The evidence suggests a coordinated effort to manipulate public perception, one that involved financial incentives and strategic media narratives. Across the United Kingdom, reactions were immediate. Social media platforms exploded with commentary, some furious, others vindicated. Hashtags like #RoyalExoneration and #MeghanExposed began trending within minutes. Television pundits engaged in heated debates, dissecting every word of the broadcast and speculating on what this would mean for Meghan's public image and her future standing. Meghan's camp, however, was not silent. Within hours, her publicist released a statement condemning the investigation as a smear campaign orchestrated by the establishment. The statement accused the royal family of manipulating the inquiry to silence Meghan's voice and delegitimize her experiences. Her team demanded an independent review of the investigation, insisting that the findings were biased and incomplete. Despite the backlash from Meghan's supporters, the momentum of the investigation continued. Whistleblowers began to step forward, emboldened by the exposure. A former PR consultant for Meghan, who had previously signed a non-disclosure agreement, agreed to speak publicly after negotiating limited immunity from legal repercussions. In an exclusive interview with a major news outlet, she detailed the behind-the-scenes strategy Meghan allegedly employed to craft her victim narrative. The consultant described how Meghan's team held strategy meetings to discuss how best to leverage accusations of racism for maximum media impact. It wasn't about justice, she stated bluntly. It was about perception. Meghan wanted to ensure she would be seen as the victim of an outdated institution. Everything was planned, right down to the words that would be used in the interview. We rehearsed it. The statement sent shockwaves through the media, further eroding Meghan's credibility and amplifying calls for accountability. Across the Atlantic, the American press began to shift its tone. Prominent talk show hosts who had once championed Meghan's bravery now raised questions about the authenticity of her claims. Political commentators weighed in, suggesting that the Duchess had weaponized social justice issues for personal gain. Polls showed a sharp decline in her public approval ratings, even among her strongest base of supporters. Celebrities who had previously stood by her side began to distance themselves, fearing association with the unraveling scandal. Back in the United Kingdom, the royal family seized the moment to solidify its position. Prince William and Kate Middleton took the lead on a series of public engagements focused on unity and reconciliation. Their appearances were marked with symbolism, handshakes with community leaders, visits to multicultural schools, and speeches centered on harmony and understanding. Their strategy was clear. They were reclaiming the narrative and reasserting the monarchy's image as a pillar of unity, not division. Queen Elizabeth herself made a rare public statement during an engagement at Windsor Castle. In her brief but poignant address, she spoke of resilience and the importance of truth. Her words were measured, but the message was clear. the monarchy had endured storms before, and it would endure this one as well. Her appearance, stoic and resolute, seemed to restore faith among many who had questioned the integrity of the institution. As the fallout continued, Meghan found herself increasingly isolated. Reports emerged that several high-profile engagements she had lined up were quietly canceled. Hollywood insiders whispered that production deals with major networks were being reevaluated, a diplomatic way of saying they were on the verge of collapse. Even Netflix, which had signed a multi-million-dollar agreement with Meghan and Harry, reportedly began to distance itself from the couple's projects, fearing negative press and public backlash. Yet Meghan remained defiant. In an exclusive interview with a sympathetic journalist, she maintained her stance, accusing the royal family of using its influence to suppress her truth. Her demeanor was visibly strained, a stark contrast to the confident figure she once portrayed. The journalist asked if she regretted coming forward with the allegations, to which Meghan replied firmly, "The truth is never something to regret." But the damage had been done. Public opinion, once fiercely divided, now leaned heavily in favor of the royal family. Polls conducted in the weeks following the televised special showed that support for Meghan had plummeted, while the monarchy's approval ratings experienced a surge. The narrative had shifted, and with it, the perception of who was truly in the right. As the dust settled from the explosive televised special, the implications of the findings continued to ripple across the globe. Buckingham Palace, now riding a wave of restored credibility, took swift action to solidify its stance against the accusations. A statement was released from the Queen's office, a rare and powerful address that reinforced the monarchy's commitment to truth and transparency. It was short but impactful, affirming the findings of the investigation and thanking those who came forward with evidence. The Queen's words resonated with the public, a reminder of the institution's resilience and its role as a symbol of unity. But while the monarchy appeared stronger, Meghan's world was unraveling at an unprecedented pace. Major news networks, once staunch supporters of her narrative, began running exposés that dissected the investigation's findings. Analysts and commentators debated how such a grand manipulation could have been orchestrated. Talk show hosts who had once praised Meghan's courage now asked difficult questions about the evidence of fabricated stories and bribery. The narrative had shifted dramatically, and with it, so too did public sentiment. Hollywood, which had embraced Meghan with open arms, started to distance itself. Media executives, wary of the scandal's fallout, began to pull back on projects that had been in development. Deals with Netflix and Spotify, which had been heavily publicized as part of Meghan and Harry's post-royal ventures, were quietly reevaluated. Industry insiders whispered about strained negotiations and postponed projects. The once celebrated narrative of defiance and independence now carried the weight of deception. For Meghan, the pressure was mounting. In her California mansion, far removed from the walls of Buckingham Palace, she remained steadfast in her defense. Through her legal team, she continued to challenge the investigation's findings, calling them biased and orchestrated by the monarchy to silence her. Statements were released, interviews were granted, and Meghan's team fought fiercely to reclaim the narrative. Yet, each attempt seemed only to fuel further skepticism. The turning point came when a high-profile American journalist, known for her hard-hitting interviews and fearless questioning, secured an exclusive sit-down with Meghan. The interview was touted as Meghan's opportunity to clear her name and provide her side of the story without the filter of palace influence. Broadcast live, millions tuned in from around the world, eager to hear what she had to say. The stage was set with dramatic flair. The backdrop was minimalist, intended to focus all attention on Meghan's words. As the camera zoomed in, she appeared poised but tense, her hands clasped tightly together. The journalist wasted no time, diving straight into the heart of the controversy. "Did you pay aides to fabricate allegations of racism against the royal family?" she asked directly, her tone firm and unyielding. Meghan hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough to be noticed. Her response, carefully measured, was a denial. She insisted that the allegations of bribery were fabrications themselves, designed to discredit her. She spoke passionately about her experiences, about feeling isolated and targeted by the institution, but there was a noticeable shift in her delivery. The confidence that had once defined her public appearances seemed tempered, replaced by a more cautious approach. The journalist pressed further, citing the evidence presented during the investigation, the financial records, the email trails, the whistleblower testimonies. Meghan deflected, calling the evidence circumstantial and accusing the investigators of bias. But as the questions grew sharper, Meghan's composure began to fray. She stumbled over her responses, pausing frequently as if weighing her words with the utmost caution. The journalist, relentless in her pursuit of clarity, asked again, "Are you saying that these aides, who have testified under oath, are all lying?" Meghan responded quickly this time, her voice sharper. "I'm saying that there are forces within the royal family that want to see me silenced. They will go to any length to protect their image, even if it means destroying mine." Her words were forceful, but the impact seemed diluted. The audience, watching live, reacted in real time across social media platforms. For the first time, public opinion appeared to sway against her. Hashtags questioning her credibility began trending, and the interview was dissected frame by media analysts. The fallout from the interview was immediate. Public relations experts criticized Meghan's approach, calling it defensive and unconvincing. Pundits debated whether her insistence on blaming palace insiders, despite mounting evidence, only made her look more guilty. Polls conducted the following week showed a staggering drop in support for Meghan, both in the UK and the United States. The once sympathetic narrative of a woman fighting against royal oppression now seemed like a carefully constructed illusion. The royal family, meanwhile, capitalized on the momentum. Prince William and Kate Middleton embarked on a goodwill tour across the Commonwealth, visiting nations with diverse populations and emphasizing themes of unity and healing. Their appearances were marked with grace and humility, contrasting sharply with the ongoing scandal surrounding Meghan. Photographs of Kate embracing schoolchildren in Jamaica and William speaking passionately about racial equality dominated headlines, pushing Meghan's narrative further into the shadows. Behind palace walls, however, the strategy was far from accidental. Senior advisors to the Queen had spent months crafting a meticulous plan to restore the monarchy's reputation. Public engagements were choreographed to project solidarity, speeches were written with inclusive language, and every media appearance was calibrated to reflect stability and compassion. The public, weary of scandal and eager for normalcy, responded positively. Meghan's team, recognizing the shift, attempted to counteract with strategic media appearances. Harry was photographed attending charity events and giving speeches about mental health, while Meghan continued to push her humanitarian projects. But the damage was done. Major networks began to pull back on interviews, hesitant to associate with the growing scandal. Prominent figures who had once stood beside Meghan distanced themselves, citing a desire to remain neutral. Even Hollywood events that had once rolled out the red carpet for her presence now hesitated to extend invitations. The culmination of the investigation's fallout came in the form of a legal summons. The whistleblowers who had testified against Meghan were now pursuing legal action, claiming defamation and emotional distress. Their cases were strong, backed by evidence that had already been presented during the investigation. Meghan's legal team worked tirelessly to delay proceedings, filing motions and appeals, but the lawsuits moved forward. A trial date was set, promising to be one of the most publicized legal battles in recent age. In the weeks leading up to the trial, Meghan remained largely out of sight. Public appearances were canceled, social media posts ceased, and her legal team declined to comment on the ongoing cases. The royal family, by contrast, moved forward with a renewed sense of purpose. Charitable engagements, public appearances, and political advocacy marked their calendar, symbolizing a return to normalcy. But even as the monarchy regained its footing, the specter of Meghan's allegations lingered. Questions remained unanswered. Whispers of conspiracy theories swirled in political circles, and debates over the truth of her claims continued to divide opinion. Yet, for the monarchy, it seemed the worst had passed. The walls of Buckingham Palace stood unshaken, the royal family remained intact, and their legacy endured. For Meghan, however, the path forward seemed far less certain, marred by legal battles, public skepticism, and a fractured image that once held so much promise. As the legal battles loomed ever closer, the media buzzed with anticipation. It wasn't just the scandal itself that captivated the public, it was the spectacle of it all. Meghan Markle, the former actress turned Duchess of Sussex, now standing trial for alleged bribery, defamation, and manipulation of public perception. It was the kind of courtroom drama that tabloids thrived upon and political commentators dissected with sharp tongues and sharper pens. In the days leading up to the trial, Meghan's legal team was in overdrive. High-profile lawyers were flown in, experts were briefed, and the narrative was prepared. Every detail mattered. Her wardrobe, her demeanor, even the expression she would wear as she entered the courtroom. Public sympathy was crucial, and Meghan's advisors were well aware of the optics. Meanwhile, the royal family remained silent, their strategy of dignified silence a stark contrast to Meghan's visible preparations. The first day of the trial drew unprecedented media attention. Journalists camped outside the courthouse, their lenses trained on every entrance and exit. Meghan arrived flanked by security, her expression stern and unreadable. She wore a sleek, muted suit, an image of professionalism and control. Reporters shouted questions, but she ignored them, her gaze fixed forward. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense, charged with expectation. Lawyers shuffled through stacks of papers, murmurs rippled through the crowd, and the judge took his seat with a deliberate sense of authority. The prosecution wasted no time laying out its case. Their opening statement was clinical, methodical, and devastatingly direct. The evidence would show, they argued, that Meghan had orchestrated a campaign of deception. Financial records were presented, tracing payments from accounts linked to Meghan's personal finances to several key aides who had publicly supported her allegations of racism and mistreatment. The sums were substantial, far more than what could be justified as routine consultation fees. The prosecution painted a picture of manipulation, one where money exchanged hands for loyalty and public statements. Text messages and emails were next. The courtroom hushed as digital records were projected onto large screens. They were displayed in chronological order, showing conversations between Meghan and her staff. In one particularly damning message, Meghan wrote, "We need to control the narrative. Make sure they know what to say. I don't want any deviation." Another message instructed a staff member to emphasize the race angle. People will understand that pain. The implications were clear. Meghan had actively sought to frame her departure from the royal family as a story of racial persecution, regardless of the truth. The defense, however, was ready. Meghan's lawyers argued that the payments were legitimate, part of consulting fees for brand development and media training. They insisted that Meghan's private communications were taken out of context and that her words, while forceful, were not indicative of deception but rather the desperation of a woman trying to protect herself against an institution that sought to destroy her. They attacked the credibility of the whistleblowers, accusing them of seeking fame and fortune at Meghan's expense. The first witnesses were called to the stand. Former palace aides took their seats, their faces pale under the scrutiny of the courtroom lights. Their testimonies were compelling, laced with details that painted a picture of tension and control. One aide recounted a moment in Kensington Palace where Meghan allegedly instructed staff to leak stories to the press if public perception turned against her. She wanted to make sure she was always the victim, the aide testified, his voice steady but his eyes reflecting the weight of the moment. If things went bad, we were supposed to release stories that would shift the blame back to the palace. The defense attempted to discredit the aide, pointing out his abrupt resignation from the royal household and suggesting it was motivated by personal grievances. But the aide held firm, his account unwavering despite the barrage of questions aimed at undermining his credibility. His testimony was followed by another former employee, who described how Meghan had directed aides to rehearse lines for media appearances, ensuring their statements aligned with her narrative of victimhood. The courtroom grew more silent with each revelation. Members of the press furiously scribbled notes, cameras flashed in the hallway outside, and the world watched as Meghan's carefully constructed public image began to erode. Yet, despite the mounting evidence, Meghan remained composed, her expression largely unchanged as she listened to the testimonies unfold. She maintained her innocence, her legal team pressing the narrative of a targeted smear campaign by the British establishment. The turning point of the trial came on the third week, when a surprise witness was called to the stand. It was Meghan's former public relations manager, someone who had worked closely with her during her transition from Hollywood to royal life. His appearance was unexpected, and the defense visibly stiffened as he took his oath. He began his testimony slowly, recounting how he had been brought on to craft Meghan's image as she stepped into the global spotlight. He described her as driven, ambitious, and deeply concerned with how she was perceived by the public. But as his testimony continued, his account took a darker turn. He described meetings where narratives were constructed, where Meghan allegedly directed staff to push stories that framed her as a victim of racism and isolation. According to his testimony, the idea was to secure public sympathy and create a platform from which she could launch her own brand independent of royal constraints. It was about control, he stated flatly. controlling the narrative, controlling the public's perception. Everything was calculated. The defense moved swiftly to discredit him, attacking his credibility and suggesting that his testimony was driven by personal vendettas. But the damage had been done. His statements corroborated much of what the whistleblowers had already described, lending weight to the allegations of manipulation and bribery. Outside the courtroom, the reaction was immediate. News anchors dissected his words, political commentators debated their implications, and public opinion swayed further against Meghan. Back in California, Meghan's team scrambled to contain the damage. Press releases were issued, denouncing the trial as a witch hunt. Prominent American figures who had once supported her now found themselves silent, distancing themselves from the unfolding chaos. Social media, which had once been a bastion of support for Meghan's narrative, turned hostile. Accusations of manipulation and deceit dominated online discussions, and hashtags demanding justice for the royal family began to trend worldwide. The royal family, still maintaining their stance of dignified silence, continued their public engagements. Prince William and Kate Middleton were seen more frequently, engaging with communities and speaking at events focused on unity and reconciliation. Their presence was a stark reminder of the stability and tradition that the monarchy represented, a contrast to the unfolding chaos in the courtroom. As the trial continued, more witnesses stepped forward, each one adding to the growing narrative of deception. Meghan's defense fought valiantly, casting doubt where they could and accusing witnesses of collusion. But with each new revelation, the public's trust in her story eroded further. The courtroom, once a battleground for narrative control, was now a stage where truths long hidden were finally being brought to light. The stakes grew higher with each passing day. Meghan's team began filing motions to dismiss charges, citing bias and lack of evidence. But the judge, unmoved by their pleas, allowed the trial to proceed. The world watched, captivated by the unfolding drama, as the story of Meghan Markle's rise and fall played out not in the gilded halls of Buckingham Palace, but in the stark and unyielding environment of a courtroom. As the trial dragged into its fourth week, the tension in the courtroom only grew more palpable. Journalists continued to flood the halls outside, eager for any updates, while television networks broadcast live analysis, dissecting every testimony and every revelation. The public, once sympathetic to Meghan's plight, now watched with a mixture of disbelief and growing skepticism. The narrative of the oppressed Duchess standing against the might of the monarchy was unraveling strand by strand. The prosecution called its next witness, a financial analyst who had been hired by the independent investigation to trace the flow of funds between Meghan and key witnesses who had publicly defended her allegations. The analyst, a bespectacled woman with a calm demeanor, took the stand and began explaining how financial trails were mapped. She outlined how payments, often masked as consultancy fees, were made to specific aides who had publicly echoed Meghan's claims of racism and mistreatment. The evidence was damning. Bank statements were displayed on the large screens, showing transactions that coincided almost precisely with media appearances and major interviews. The sums were substantial, far more than what would be considered standard for mere consultation or advisory roles. The analyst went further, describing how these transactions were funneled through shell companies and third-party accounts to obscure their origins. It was a strategy that suggested forethought and careful planning, designed to protect the source of the funds while ensuring loyalty from those who benefited. The defense objected repeatedly, challenging the validity of the evidence and accusing the prosecution of relying on circumstantial interpretations. Meghan's lawyers argued that the payments were legitimate, part of broader media consultancy packages meant to help aides handle press interactions. But the prosecution countered with timestamps and synchronized records that suggested otherwise. It was hard to ignore the fact that the bulk of these payments coincided almost perfectly with Meghan's media appearances and interviews that heavily leaned into allegations of racism and mistreatment by the royal family. To solidify their case, the prosecution called upon another key witness, a former financial advisor who had once been part of Meghan's inner circle. His testimony was perhaps the most damaging of all. He spoke of meetings held in California, where strategic narratives were crafted and financial incentives were discussed. According to him, Meghan was deeply involved in these meetings, often directing her team on how to manage public perception. She was always 2 steps ahead, he recounted. Everything had to fit the narrative. If there was a deviation, it was corrected before it could spiral. When asked to elaborate, The advisor described how Meghan's team carefully selected which aides would go public with stories of racism and which would remain silent. Those who agreed to speak out were allegedly compensated, their financial security ensured so long as they stuck to the script. There were rehearsals, he added. We would go through the talking points, anticipate questions, and prepare responses. It was all very meticulous. The defense attempted to discredit him, citing his departure from Meghan's team under contentious circumstances. But his testimony, combined with the financial evidence, began to cement a narrative of manipulation that was hard to refute. The public perception continued to shift. Major news outlets ran headlines like "The Cost of Loyalty," "Meghan's Secret Payments Exposed," and "The Duchess's Empire of Influence." Editorials criticized her for exploiting sensitive issues for personal gain, and political commentators began to question her integrity. Meghan, for her part, remained defiant. Through her legal team, she released statements denying the allegations, calling the trial a character assassination orchestrated by those determined to discredit her. She pointed fingers at the monarchy, accusing them of using their influence to manipulate the investigation and sway public opinion. Her statements, however, began to fall on increasingly deaf ears. Public sentiment, once overwhelmingly in her favor, had shifted dramatically. Social media platforms that had once championed her cause now hosted debates questioning her sincerity and motives. The royal family, meanwhile, remained steadfast in their silence. Buckingham Palace continued its routine of public engagements, carefully curated to project an image of stability and resilience. Prince William and Kate Middleton took center stage, attending events focused on unity and reconciliation. Their appearances were met with warm receptions, a stark contrast to the controversy engulfing Meghan. For the first time since the allegations began, the monarchy's reputation seemed to be on the mend. The trial moved into its sixth week, and the prosecution called upon its final witness, a former palace aide who had served under both Harry and Meghan during their time at Kensington Palace. His testimony was highly anticipated, as rumors had swirled that he possessed critical information about the internal workings of their media strategy. When he took the stand, the room fell silent, the anticipation palpable. He began by describing his initial experience working with the couple, detailing how Meghan had a clear vision for how she wanted to be perceived by the public. According to him, Meghan was meticulous about her image, often demanding that press releases be worded precisely to elicit sympathy and support. It was all about perception, he stated calmly. If there was a negative story, we were instructed to counter it immediately with something positive, whether it was true or not. He went on to describe instances where Meghan allegedly directed staff to leak stories about her humanitarian efforts, even when those events had not yet taken place. There were moments where we would prepare press releases for charitable visits weeks before they happened, sometimes before they were even confirmed. It was about staying ahead of the narrative. His testimony was punctuated by records of email exchanges and meeting notes, all submitted into evidence. The most explosive part of his testimony came when he revealed that there had been a coordinated effort to highlight allegations of racism as a primary focus of Meghan's public persona. He described internal discussions where Meghan allegedly strategized how to use accusations of racial bias to shift public perception in her favor. It wasn't just about telling her story, it was about crafting it, he said, his voice steady. We were told that if the narrative of racism stuck, it would be untouchable. No one would question it. The courtroom was silent as he spoke, the weight of his words sinking in. Members of the press exchanged glances, scribbling furiously in their notebooks. Meghan's legal team objected repeatedly, accusing the aide of lying and suggesting that his testimony was motivated by a personal vendetta. But the damage was done. His statements, combined with the financial records and the testimonies of other aides, created a narrative that Meghan had not just exaggerated her experiences, but actively orchestrated them. Outside the courtroom, the public reaction was swift. Demonstrations erupted outside Buckingham Palace, with signs both supporting and condemning Meghan. The hashtag Meghan manipulation trended worldwide, while political commentators began to call for accountability. Prominent figures who had once supported Meghan began to distance themselves publicly, citing the growing body of evidence that suggested a deliberate attempt to manipulate public opinion. For the royal family, the shift in perception was a turning point. Public support for the monarchy grew, with polls indicating a rise in approval for the Queen, Prince William, and Kate Middleton. Meghan's support base, once robust and vocal, began to fracture. Even American networks that had championed her narrative now ran segments questioning the validity of her claims. The trial, though still ongoing, had already left its mark. Meghan's brand, which had once been built on narratives of strength and resilience, now faced the shadow of deceit and manipulation. Hollywood, once eager to embrace her as a symbol of modern royalty, grew hesitant. Sponsors quietly withdrew, and major projects were placed on indefinite hold. Her once bright future in media and advocacy seemed to fade under the harsh light of scrutiny. As the courtroom drama continued to unfold, the media's gaze remained unflinchingly focused on every revelation and testimony. Meghan's legal team, now backed into a corner, escalated their defense. They began presenting character witnesses, figures from Meghan's past who could attest to her integrity and her long-standing commitment to social justice. Former co-stars from her days on the television series Suits took the stand, describing her as generous, kind-hearted, and deeply empathetic. They spoke of her charity work, her advocacy for gender equality, and her outspoken support for marginalized communities. But despite their heartfelt words, the impact was limited. Public opinion had shifted dramatically, and the evidence presented by the prosecution had already left its mark. Financial records, meticulously documented emails, and damning testimonies from former aides painted a portrait of strategic manipulation that was difficult to ignore. The defense's attempts to humanize Meghan, though sincere, seemed to fall short against the mountain of evidence stacked against her. The trial reached a critical juncture when the defense called Meghan to the stand. It was a move widely debated by legal analysts, with some praising the boldness of the decision and others questioning the wisdom of placing her under direct scrutiny. But Meghan seemed prepared as she entered the witness box, her demeanor calm and composed. The courtroom hushed as she took her oath, her gaze steady as she looked out over the sea of faces fixed upon her. Her testimony began with a recounting of her early days in Hollywood, her rise to fame, and the challenges she faced as a biracial woman in the entertainment industry. She spoke eloquently about her charity work, her advocacy for women's rights, and her passion for social justice. Her voice wavered slightly as she described the pressure of public scrutiny after marrying into the royal family, detailing moments of isolation and despair. There were flashes of vulnerability in her voice, moments where she seemed genuinely pained by the experiences she recounted. But when the cross-examination began, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The prosecution was relentless, dissecting her statements with clinical precision. They began by addressing the financial records, presenting transaction logs that had been previously displayed in court. Meghan maintained that the payments were for consultancy services and media training, but the prosecution pressed further, questioning why these payments coincided so directly with media appearances and public statements defending her narrative. One particularly intense exchange focused on a series of emails between Meghan and a senior aide, in which she allegedly directed them to ensure the message is clear: racism is the narrative. Meghan denied that the emails were indicative of manipulation, insisting instead that she was merely trying to articulate her lived experiences. But the prosecution produced additional correspondence, this time between Meghan and a media strategist, outlining a public relations strategy centered on exposing institutional bias. The strategist's notes, shown on screen for the jury, suggested that Meghan wanted the narrative to be unassailable, leveraging the concept of racism to shield herself from criticism. Meghan's composure began to falter under the weight of the questioning. Her responses grew shorter, her gaze more defensive. The prosecution pressed harder, bringing up the testimonies of former palace aides who had spoken about rehearsals and scripted media responses. They questioned her directly. Did you, or did you not, instruct your staff to emphasize racial discrimination, regardless of whether it was true? Meghan's response was measured, but her voice wavered slightly. I instructed them to speak their truth, she replied. But the prosecutor did not relent, immediately following up with, even if their truth was purchased? The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. Meghan's legal team objected, calling the line of questioning leading and prejudicial. The judge permitted the questioning to continue, much to the visible discomfort of Meghan and her defense. The prosecution moved swiftly, playing a recording submitted by a whistleblower. A conversation between Meghan and a senior aide, discussing media strategies. Meghan's voice could be heard instructing the aide to make sure they feel it, referring to the public's reaction to claims of discrimination. We need them to be outraged. That's how we win. The audio recording sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Meghan's legal team scrambled to file objections, claiming the recording was taken out of context and edited maliciously. The judge allowed the recording to stand, noting its relevance to the case. The audience in the gallery murmured amongst themselves, the atmosphere thick with disbelief and tension. For many, this was the smoking gun, the undeniable proof of orchestration behind the claims. The trial entered its final stages with the defense attempting to recover lost ground. Meghan's lawyers called upon more character witnesses, even producing statements from global charity organizations that praised her advocacy and financial contributions. But the damage had been done. The public's trust, once solid, had fractured. Polls showed a sharp decline in support, not just in the UK, but internationally. Major media outlets that had once championed Meghan's bravery now ran segments questioning the authenticity of her claims and the legitimacy of her narrative. The prosecution's closing arguments were succinct and powerful. They framed Meghan as a calculated strategist who had exploited sensitive issues to manipulate public perception and secure her position both financially and socially. They spoke of deception, manipulation, and the strategic use of racism as a shield against criticism. They left the jury with a singular question: if the truth was on her side, why did she need to pay for loyalty? The defense's closing statements attempted to recapture the spirit of victimhood that had once defined Meghan's public persona. They spoke of her struggle against institutional power, her bravery in speaking out, and the injustice of her treatment by the press. But there was a noticeable lack of momentum. The prosecution's evidence had been too overwhelming, too meticulously documented to ignore. The jury deliberated for days, their discussion shrouded in secrecy. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered, holding signs both in support of Meghan and in defense of the royal family. News networks speculated on the outcome, while political commentators weighed in on the potential ramifications for both Meghan's brand and the monarchy itself. Social media platforms were ablaze with debates, hashtags trending daily as the world awaited a verdict. Finally, after nearly a week of deliberation, the jury returned to the courtroom. The atmosphere was electric, the tension almost unbearable. Meghan sat alongside her legal team, her expression stoic but her eyes betraying a flicker of anxiety. The judge entered, the room fell silent, and the head juror stood to deliver the verdict. On the charges of bribery and manipulation